Okay, so now that we've talked about what we're going to do, let's talk about how you need to get started. So the first thing you need to do is get your materials collected that you're going to use in the project. And so for right now, what we can focus on is that if, let's just say that this is going to be a group project, and let's say that each individual has to create his or her own kind of like a card, let's call it a card, where basically the interface can take you to that card, just like I showed you in the previous example. And so that each card, would have one person's maybe photograph with a byline, the name of the piece or the word that you're using for the title, and then the card would also have the person's video displayed on it. And then there was also some other navigation on there, but we can talk about that separately. All right, so for right now, let's just go ahead and say that what we need for right now is your video and photograph of yourself. The other thing I want to point out really quickly is you can see here I've got Adobe Flash Player Installer sitting on my desktop. One of the things that you might want to go ahead and do is if you're using Chrome, all right, so the web browser Google Chrome, then Flash Player will already be installed, so you don't have to worry about it because Google Chrome will automatically update itself. If your favorite browser is something else, however, then you need to make sure that you have the newest version of Flash Player installed on it. Otherwise, your content won't be viewable. It won't work right. So that means like Safari, Firefox, if you use Opera for some reason. And what you can do is you can go to Adobe's website, and I pulled it up here. So you go to adobe.com, and then you can click on menu, and then you want to scroll down towards the bottom, and where it says Adobe Flash Player, go ahead and click on that. And if you are currently using, like I'm using Chrome right now, and it tells me, hey, Chrome already takes care of this, but what you can do is you can look at where it says, do you have a different operating system or browser? You can click on that. And then you would select your operating system. So for instance, I'll select that. And then you would select the version that you want, like for Safari and Firefox, right? Or the other one would be Chrome or Opera. Now, just because Chrome automatically updates it, my version of Opera doesn't seem to have it, so I would need to download it for Opera too and install it. You could download and follow the instructions. Okay, so that's something that you are going to want to have in place, otherwise you'll need to install it later. But you can also just go ahead and use Chrome because it's going to automatically have it. All right, so now that we've got these things started, let's go ahead and let's open up Photoshop first, actually. And I want to show you, like this is a picture that I pulled up of myself. All right, so it corresponds with this photograph that that I have that I'm going to use in my project. And when I said before that you should collect your stuff, what I also mean is you should put all of those assets in the same folder. So don't just have them sitting around floating on your desktop or something. Make sure that you put them in a folder. I named my folder Animate CC project. Okay, so let's just really quickly look at this photograph. If you wanted to get the properties, you could look at your image size properties in Photoshop. And this photograph is 500 by 500, which should be fine because I don't really want it to be that big on the screen. And this would allow that even if I scaled on a really large screen, I still don't expect that the photograph will ever be larger than 500 by 500 pixels. So this would be an adequate size, all right? If you know that something's going to definitely never be even that big, you could even make it smaller, but this is a reasonable size. One of the things that you'll see later in Animate that we might want to do is like, if I wanted to have this with a circular mask, then one of the things that I could do is I could either mask it in Animate, or if you know for a fact that you want it to be a bitmap, this is a bitmap or raster based image, then you could also go ahead and do the masking in Photoshop to output it as a transparent PNG. So I'm going to show you two different methods later. All right, so let's take a look at what we've got in our layers. If you're not familiar with Photoshop, when you open up your file, your picture file, you can go to the layers panel, and if this is what the visual shortcut looks like over in these side panels, but if it's not showing or you can't find it, you can always go up to window and then choose layers, okay? And then your layers panel will pop up. Right now what we have is one layer. It's got a little lock on it. The irony is that there are a lot of things that you can't do to the locked background layer. It wants you to duplicate it, and this is the way that I would create a new layer. If I wanted to duplicate it, I would drag it and drop it on top of this little page icon to create a new layer. But the irony is that although there are a lot of things you can't do to a background image that has a lock on it, um, you can actually still mask it. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a circle with the, you can either use a selection tool or you could use a vector tool, whichever one is easier. So this is the elliptical marquee. So if I put it sort of like somewhere in the center, then I could kind of get an idea of where it would start. The alternative, instead of guessing, would be that you could turn on your guides and grids, and you can set up your guides. If I go up to Photoshop preferences on a Mac, or on Windows it would be under edit, and then preferences would be down towards the bottom. So Photoshop preferences, and then if you go to where it says guides, grids, and slices, you can set this up so that your grid line occurs like every 100 pixels, all right, since we have 500 by 500, or whatever your equal division happens to be, right? And so I can make it so that it has 4 subdivisions, or I can make it have just 1 subdivision. And that means that it'll put, it basically won't have subdivisions, right? So, all right, so let's go OK. And then I can go up here and I can say view at the top, and we're going to go where it says show, and we're going to say grid. All right, so then it shows my grid. Now the other thing too that I can do is I want to make sure where it says view, I want to make sure that snap is turned on. So if it's got a check mark, it's turned on, and I can say snap, look under snap to, and make sure that it's going to snap to the grid. Okay, so now I can start to see a better center. But problem is I was wrong. To get dead center, I do need subdivisions. So what I can go back now to do is I can go back to my preferences, go back to guides and grids, and for the subdivisions, let's say every 2. So it'll divide each one of those boxes in half so that I can get the center. And this is, see, now I can get dead center. And so when I click here, my marquee tool will snap. All right, so for marquee, you want to make sure that you've got the elliptical marquee, and if you click and hold in Photoshop, anything that's got a little arrow next to it down the bottom corner means you can click and hold to see other hidden options that are underneath it. So make sure you've got elliptical marquee. You're going to click in the center, you're going to click, hold your mouse, and then you're going to hold the Option key or Alt on Windows and the Shift key down, and then you're going to draw outwards, and it will, the Shift key is constraining it to a perfect circle, while the Option Alt key is allowing you to draw out from the center. Okay, and so then the first thing you're going to let up off of is your mouse. All right, if you let up off the other keys first, it'll do something strange. So that gave me an elliptical, well, perfect circular marquee tool that will allow me to crop this image. Or I shouldn't say crop, I should say mask. Okay, so now let me just show you. I'll do this again, but I'm going to just click somewhere to deselect. If I didn't hold those keys down and I just started drawing, you see it draws from the top corner or the bottom corner. It draws from like a bottom corner outwards, right? And then if I held down Shift, it would still constrain it. In fact, let me just blow this up a little bit so to make sure that you can see it really, really well. Okay, actually that's a little bit big. All right, so to do this, let's pick that marquee tool again. If I start drawing without holding down the Option key, then I can get any sort of weird shape of ellipse that that I want. Then if I add the Shift key, right, it constrains it. But then if I add Option, look, see, it's starting from where I began my drawing, which is sort of up here. And if I hold down Option, it comes back out from the center. All right, so that's not what we want. That's why it's better to go ahead and click in the center where you want to start it, hold down Option Shift, draw outwards, right? And then once you, and see how it snaps in place, it's because I have snap to grid turned on. And then if I let up off of my mouse key, or my mouse first, and then I let up off my keys, then it will give me that perfect circle. Okay, so now to mask it, let's just go back to our layers panel, And again, if you can't find it somewhere over here, you don't see this little stacking layers, then you can go up here to Window and choose Layers. All right, so now while I have my background image selected, or the only layer basically that is in my Layers panel, I want to come down here to where it's got like a little, it almost looks like a camera. It's got like a rectangle with a circle in the middle, and if you hover over it for long enough, it'll say add a mask. I'm going to click on mask, and you see what it does is it adds this mask, and it added a mask to my layer so that it is masking out anything that was outside of that selection. Okay, so now what we can do, and if you don't like looking at the grid, you can always go back up here to say go back to show and then turn the grid off, and then you can see what it'll look like. And then if you wanted to put some sort of stroke around it, you could do that. That would be fine. However you want to do that. Now the thing is if you were to put like a drop shadow around it or something from this point, then we would actually sort of have a problem, because the drop shadow would go outside the boundaries of this particular document, right? Because we'd have these sort of fuzzy soft pixels, but because this goes right up to the edge of the document, the problem that we would have is that those drop shadow pixels would get cut off. So that you would have to actually then make the canvas a little bit bigger. And if you know wanted to do that, or the other alternative would be that you make this image smaller, or I shouldn't say the image, but the layer smaller. So if we wanted to come here, we could scale this. So you could say edit, and you would go under transform, and then you would select scale. And then what it's going to allow me to do is sort of scale this image in. Now, again, if I click and hold the corner, I want to hold shift to constrain it so it doesn't change the ratio dimensions. And then if I hold option, it'll scale it from the center. If I don't do that, right, if I just click and hold and shift, see, it scales it from the corner. That's not what I want to have happen. All right, and every time I undo it, I'm just doing Command or Control Z as in zebra. Command Control Z will only go back one time though. If you want to go back further, you would need to use your history panel. You would go under Window, and then you would choose history. And you can go backwards. Now, right now it's not going to let me, because you can see that I'm in the middle of using a tool, the scale tool, and I can tell because all of these little boxes that are around the edge of my document. So if for some reason, like let's say you tried to do it and you went, and it's making that little beeping noise or something, it won't let you go backwards, you might want to see if you're currently using a tool. All right, and sometimes that happens where people get really frustrated and they can't figure out why something's not working. Maybe it's because they're currently in the middle of using a tool. Anyway, and so then all you would have to do is escape, use the escape key to get out of this, and then you could use your history panel. But anyway, let's go back and let's actually look at how we can fool with this. So I'm still in the middle of my tool. I'm gonna, as I said before, I'm gonna click, Option Shift, drag. So if I make it maybe about that big, right, then what I could do is hit Enter to commit to it. And now if I wanted to add drop shadows, or a drop shadow or some sort of circular stroke around this, I could do so. And so one of the things that you could go ahead and figure out is, let's just look at our layers panel, and I'll click on where it's the pixels, right, not the mask. That's the mask. See how it highlights what I've chosen? I'm going to click the little face picture right here, and then I'm going to go down where it says FX, and I can show how to create a drop shadow. It's the very bottom option. And then it's going to pop up this layer style window. Now, one of the things that is true of this window is that it can't be rescaled. So if you want to try to get it out of the way to see what you're doing, sometimes it can be hard if you're on a small screen. One thing that I can do though is I can sort of scoot it out of the way, and then I can also close my layer panel so that I have a better visibility of what I'm looking at here. And I'm going to scoot it over even further, and so I can still see my little controls right here. All right, now what I'm looking at is it's really hard to see any drop shadow that's being applied because my opacity is turned down for some reason. Yours might start up at 75 roughly. I think that's the pretty much the standard. I probably had mine turned down previously for some other thing that I did, and so it remembered that setting. So what you can do is turn it up so that you can see it, and then if you make the distance low enough and the size low enough, then it'll start to pull it in more towards the actual icon. Right now, the other thing too that I want you to notice is that look at the angle that it's set at. Yours might be set at something different. Um, so what's happening with the angle the way it is that it's like the light source is in the top right corner shooting down, sort of down towards the left, and so you can see that the shadow is in the lower left. So one of the things is if you're going to be putting drop shadows everywhere on different things in your layout, you want to make sure that the light source is always going to be the same. And if you were developing this just in Photoshop, you'd probably want to use global light, which means that everything in the entire document is going to have the same light source so that all of the angles would be the same, right? And you can click and drag this and change it. One of the things that I tend to want to do, unless I have a very specific light source that I'm trying to use, I'll sometimes just set mine at 90 degrees so that the light is coming straight down. And then that way you get stuff that right under, basically the drop shadows right underneath. It really is kind of up to you. If you want it skewed off to the side, you'll need to change this angle. And you can adjust, like I said before, the distance a little bit. You want to make sure not to do the distance so far or the spread so far that some of the softest edges of the pixels go outside of the boundary of your document, because then it'll look like it gets cut off, right? So you could adjust the spread so that it's a little bit, literally it's spreading out further. And then the size is basically like the blur. And this is another one where you want to be careful not to let that blur go outside the boundary. You can see that at the bottom here, if I increase the size, it is going to blur out in a way that some of that blur gets cut off. All right, so I'm gonna lower that opacity a little bit, and I can pull my distance in and increase my size also so that it's a softer edge. It's just very subtle. And if you wanted to see what this looks like, let's go ahead and commit to it. You want to see maybe what it looks like. You can go ahead and in your layers, you can create a new layer with this little page icon, and you can drag that layer underneath, right, like that, and then you can fill it. Now I'm gonna, down here in the lower left is where I've got my fill colors. The foreground color is currently set to gray, so I'm gonna click that and I'm gonna drag it all the way to the very widest of the white. It should say FF, FF, FF. All right, and then what I can do is I can take my paint bucket tool, which is right here, and if your gradient tool is showing for some reason, click and hold it and choose the paint bucket tool. And then while your background empty layer is selected, you can click on it and it'll fill it, and then that way you can see maybe what it would look like, for instance, on a white background. And you can start to see whether or not that blur exceeds the edge of your document, and I think that this is probably okay. I think that this is probably going to be all right. And you can see also that I'm at 215% down here. I blew it up pretty big. So if I want to go down to 100% in the bottom left, I can click and choose the value, type in 100, and that's what the graphic would actually look like. But before I save it out, I want to actually get rid of this white background layer. So I'll click the eyeball button in the layers panel, and now I can go up to File, and I can choose export, and then I can do quick export as PNG. But what I would do, because you might be on a computer where the settings have been changed, I'll go export as. That way I can control exactly what's going to happen to that picture. Okay, and you see the format was set to JPEG, so quick export might not have worked. All right, so I'm going to choose PNG, make sure transparency is enabled. It gives you a little preview of what it will look like. And here, just so you know, if you needed to make different things with different sizes, this is also where you could go ahead and do that over here. And then I'm going to leave convert to sRGB on and leave everything else on. I'll say export all. And then now I'm going to give it a different name. I'll call it 500 and I'll call it masked. Okay. You could call it circular or whatever. I'll just say masked. And then that way I'll know what I've got. And you see it shows me that it just created that image. I can take a peek at it, right? Okay. All right, and you didn't have to put it there with a drop shadow. And just in case you wanted to have some different options, you could also, let's actually go back here real quick to my Finder or your Explorer window if you're in Windows. And where it says masked, I'm actually going to say masked, and I'll say DS for drop shadow, okay? So I know that this one has a drop shadow. If you wanted to make one that does not have a drop shadow on it, you could do so, right? So you could just simply come back into Photoshop. You could hide the effects right here, and then it took that drop shadow off, right? And then I could go back up here to File, Export, Export As again. All right, I'm gonna do this again, leave everything the same, Export All, and then this time I'll just call it just masked, okay? So that I know that just the masked one doesn't have a drop shadow. And then the other thing too is, like, let's say that you wanted to put a stroke around this. Well, let's do that real quick. All right, so make sure you select your little pixel icon of the picture. And then the other thing too is that we need to turn the effects back on. So let's click on the drop shadow visibility, and now our effects are turned back on. Without doing that, we're not going to be able to see the preview of what we're about to do. And so, because we're going to be adding an effect of a stroke, all right? And so one thing, let me just show you really quickly, one thing that you can do is just go over here and click on stroke, and I'm going to move this over, and then you'll see here that I've got the size I can adjust, right? And then I can tell it whether or not to be in the center. First of all, I'm going to change the color. Like if you don't want a white stroke, although maybe a white stroke wouldn't be bad, depending on what the color of your text is going to be. And this is one of those things where you might want to do this part in Flash, because unless you actually know all of the colors you're going to use, and hopefully actually maybe you've already figured that out, but in the event that you don't, you might not want to add this because maybe you want this color to match the text or something. But if you do know the color you're going to use, let's say it's going to be sort of this sort of peachy color, right? Let's say that that's the color you're going to use. We'll go ahead and click on that, and now you can set the size and the scale of the stroke. And this is currently at 100%, right? So yeah, the other thing too, yeah, it won't let me do that. Okay, I was going to see if it would let me turn on my background layer so I could see what it looked like on top of white, but it didn't let me do that. So I can turn the stroke up. You can see how it works. If I want it to be on the outside, then that's going to start to cover up some of your drop shadow. You could also make it on the inside, and that starts to cover up some of the picture. So maybe center is a good choice. And then you could also, probably 16 is too big. It just depends on what you're trying to do. So maybe like an 8-pixel stroke on that would be fine. Okay, and then you can change the blend mode if you want, but that's really only if you've got other stuff behind it, and you want it to interact with the way that the colors are, but you're not going to have that in this example. So leave the blend mode as normal, and I would recommend that you also leave the opacity at 100%. And so you can click on OK, and now we can see what it looks like, with something else behind it. So it depends on whether or not your background is going to be white or black or some other dark color, as to whether or not you want to probably put that stroke and like how you want the drop shadow to be. And then if you wanted to export this out, again, you could go back out to export and then save this as something else, with a new name so that we know that it has a stroke on it. So let's actually do that. Let's go export as. All right, and then we'll just export this out, and we'll name this one, we'll call it masked, and we'll call it stroke dash DS for drop shadow. Okay, so it has both. So you could save out different versions in case you're not sure what you want. Now here's the other deal too. Since you might be doing this where you've got multiple versions of this, like where let's say that for instance, if you're working in this group and you want everybody's images to look consistent. The other thing that you can do is, maybe there would be one person in the group who could output the way that these images are going to look. And so what's kind of nice is that let's say that I had another image that I wanted to use. All right, this isn't necessarily going to be true for everybody, but this is one option. I could go ahead and pull in another layer and I can just apply all of the same stuff to this. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So what I did is I'm going to show you really quickly up in the Finder is I went ahead and inside of my project folder I added Mr. Potato Head, okay, and I named the file potato.jpg. And let's say that he's another one of my group members, okay, and ideally, if you were going to be the one in charge of maybe outputting all of these images so that they're all identical, then you could go ahead and have all of your members' files. They'd have to provide you with a file, and you would want to make sure that they're at least as big as your native size. So you'd have to kind of decide, all right, well, 500 by 500 maybe is big enough, right? So you could go ahead and get all of their stuff. They'd have to give it to you, right? So let's come back over here, and first of all, you could take it and you could literally just take him and drag him into the document. So let's do that. And what it does is it places it, if I commit to this, it places it as a linked file. And so that way, if I ever want to go and make an update to this file by literally changing this file by, I don't know, changing its color or you know, putting some writing or something on top of it or whatever, then it would automatically update in this file, which we haven't saved yet. So we should do that. Right now we have an unsaved document. All right, it says it's a little asterisk up here. That means it's not saved. So if I were to go and go File, Save, it wants to save it as a PSD because now I have a bunch of layer information. And so I can save it inside my Animate CC project. Let's go ahead and save. Okay, and so now we have a new saved document, right? And you'll see that we've got, it's called, where is it? Right here. And I don't want to change the name of it. I could have changed the name. Later we'll maybe change the name of this, but you don't want to ever change the name of the file while it's currently open and being used. So we'll deal with that later. So anyway, I've got Mr. Potato Head in here. And what I need to do is I want to load that exact same circle. I don't want to draw a new one. I want to load the same circle. So I can, if you remember, I showed you in channels, it's actually saved, but here it's not showing it as saved. It's showing this as Mr. Potato Head. What's happening is because it's a smart object, this little icon right here indicates that it's a smart object. It means that we're currently looking at the settings for this separate file inside of our larger PSD file. So what I need to do is click on this layer, right? And now it knows that I'm looking at the files inside that are native to this current PSD file. And then if I look at channels, it shows me that that channel is there. Well, if I want to be able to use a channel that's currently in this document, then what I need to be able to do is duplicate it as a channel, because right now it's just what is referred to as a layer mask. So for instance, if I went to potato and I said, I'm going to go and say select, load selection, there are no selections here from the channels for me to load. So to do this, I'm going to click on this layer, right? And then I'm going to go over here to channels. And if channels isn't right here, then you'll have to go up to window and then pull channels up that way. And I'm going to turn this on, okay? And you see that it's actually showing me where my selection is, okay? So anyway, you can turn it on or turn it off, whatever, but I'm going to right click and I'm going to say duplicate channel, and I'm going to label it as circle mask, okay? And so now it's created as a circle mask. Now that I've got this, it's not just a layer mask any longer. It's actually something that I can apply to anything that's inside of this PSD file. So I'm going to turn all of these back on so that way I can turn this one off, right? But leave circle mask there. And now if I go back into layers and I choose Mr. Potato Head, all right, as my layer, I can go up to say select, load selection, and then now I can choose the circle mask and say okay, and see there it gives me my selection that is identical to the one that I had before, which is perfect, right? So now what I can do is just go ahead and I can mask Mr. Potato Head, which is great. Now the other thing too that is happening is that I'm going to be able now to take these same effects, all right? So I can right click here on the effects, and I can say copy layer style like that, and then I can choose potato, and I can right click and I can say paste layer style wherever it is, right here, paste layer style, and now I get the exact same effects on Mr. Potato Head as I did on my my other one. Okay, my layer. Let's label this. Actually, let's call it Lee. Okay, so I'm going to name that, and then this would be Potato Head or something like that. Okay, and so now I can turn off and turn on different layers. I can turn my layer off, right, so that we've just got Potato Head, and now I can go over here, and while he's showing, while he's visible, I can export as, and then I'll export it as that transparent PNG. Okay, export, and then we'll call him Potato Head, and then masked, and then stroke dash DS for drop shadow. Okay, so now you can see how you could like put everybody's files inside of one document in Photoshop, and then just turn the visibility on and off, copy and paste layer styles, and then just output them so that they're all going to be identical. Okay, so that's a quick tutorial, and of course you could apply this principle that I just showed you in lots of different ways for a Photoshop document, but it's one of the ways that you can generate some assets that you can use in all of your different group cards, individual group cards for your project. And the last thing that I did want to show you is that I really don't like that I forgot to change the name of this PSD file to something that made a little bit more sense than Lee Color 500 cropped .psd. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and save the changes one more time. I'm gonna close this file, and then now I can change the name that now that it's closed, and I'll change the name to something like composite. I don't know, headshots or something like that. So composite headshots or snapshots or whatever you want to call it. And now this this file is clearly different than all the other ones. And if you wanted to do, I would recommend that you do a little bit of file organization. All right, these are all images right now except for this video. What you could do is you can right click, say new folder, and let's just call it images or image, let's say image assets or something like that. And then let's just put all of our stuff inside of image assets. Actually, let's do, there we go. There we go. All right, so now we've got some file organization, and you don't necessarily need to put your movie in a separate folder because you're only going to have one movie. If you had a lot of different movies later, like if you were doing the composite group piece, then you might want to put stuff in a folder called movies. But just because we have so many different pictures here, you might, want to put your stuff in one particular folder. Okay. So that's going to do it for the end of this demo, and you can move on to the next where we actually get into Animate.